What if Jeffrey Epstein was a UFC fighter? This question has never been asked before, but hey, you clicked on the video and you're watching now, so I'm sure you want to know. I believe that Jeffrey Epstein, if he had not done what I was about to do after Kai Issachar lost in humiliating fashion to 38-year-old Tim Elliott coming off of a 2-year layoff due to injury, would have had the potential to become an all-time legend in the UFC. And to explain why I think that's the case, today I will be going over what Jeffrey Epstein would have been like as a UFC fighter by examining the skill set he would have, the appeal he would have as a fighter, and then briefly discuss how a UFC run likely would have gone for him. So let us now ponder. How would Jeffrey Epstein have done in the UFC? Getting started, the thing that Jeffrey Epstein is known for the most is that he was a big fan of Carlos Prates. A huge fan, in fact. And he was such a big fan of Carlos Prates that he wanted all the rich people who he associated himself with to become fans of Carlos Prates as well. Guys like Prince Andrew, Bill Clinton, and of course, the Big Don himself have all been associated with Epstein, and may all have been encouraged to become fans of Carlos Prates by Jeffrey. Since Jeffrey is a huge fan of Carlos Prates, I think we can assume that Jeffrey would be a practitioner of Muay Thai. And that makes a lot of sense, since most Muay Thai fighters start training and fighting in the sport at a very, very, very young age, which I'm sure is right down Jeffrey's alley. Also, Thailand has been a destination for many Carlos Prates enthusiasts for decades at this point. So yeah, I think everything lines up to tell us that Jeffrey's striking base would have been in Muay Thai. Now, what about Jeffrey's wrestling? Well, for that, we need to look at the other people who shared the same interests as Jeffrey in the UFC. And guess what? There's a top contender with insane grappling who has the same mindset towards women that Jeffrey Epstein did. And that is Movsar Evloev.
She was 17.
Yeah.
Yes, and I was 23, she was 17. And when your wife's a little bit younger,
It's easier to make her your wife.
you're married like an older woman. She already has
Big
her waist.
experience.
She has her experience. She has her waist set. It's hard.
She has opinions.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when you marry younger, it's much easier to
Mold her, make her your wife.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So to
Let her
make-
fit into the mold of your life.
Exactly.
Instead of hear her talk too much. Yeah.
Like if it says she doesn't have all that garbage.
Yeah, she's not programmed yet.
Program. Yeah. That's a good right.
As you just heard there from Movsar himself, he and Jeffrey Epstein have the same values when it comes to how they view relationships. So I think we can assume that Jeffrey Epstein would have Movsar's wrestling. Because, if Movsar and Jeffrey both agree that a girl's sweet 16 is also the sweetest they'll ever be, they probably agree on other things, like the importance of wrestling from an early age. So okay, we have Muay Thai and a strong wrestling base. But how about Jeffrey's Jiu-Jitsu? Well, to be frank, you've already got your answer right there. Jiu-Jitsu. What is Jeffrey's background? Exactly. So I think we all know that his Jiu-Jitsu is going to be absolutely top-notch. So we've got some Carlos Prates striking, some Movsar Evloev wrestling, and some absolutely kosher grappling skills on top of that. So I think that the fighter who Jeffrey Epstein would be closest to being like is Charles Oliveira. And shout out to DuBronx, because he listens in on the Twitter spaces that I hold. This is a sign to follow me on Twitter, by the way. Also, I hope you're seething, MMHA. But now that we know Jeffrey Epstein's skill set, let's talk about Jeffrey Epstein's UFC journey, starting with how he would first get into the promotion. Nowadays, there are 4 major ways to get into the UFC. The first is to get signed directly to the UFC. This usually doesn't happen unless you're someone fighting as a short notice replacement, or you're a champion from another organization like the PFL or Ryzen, or Bellator or Ryzen, or KSW or Ryzen, or Octagon or Ryzen. And there was another promotion that I think Rainier de Ridder fought at before coming to the UFC. I can't remember much about it though, besides the fact that they've lost $500 million without a single cent of profit since being created though. But leaving that aside, the second way to get into the UFC is through The Ultimate Fighter, which is basically a show where guys who got cut from the UFC go to max out their fraud checking skills and beat up on young regional level guys with padded records. Seriously, the most recent winner of The Ultimate Fighter, Joseph Morales, went 1-2 in the UFC during his first run, then came back on tough and fraud checked an undefeated Kazakhstani guy. Then there was Brad Katona, who holds the distinction of winning tough twice, and he's also been cut from the UFC after both runs as well. The third way is to go through the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Hiring Tournament for Asian fighters, otherwise known as Road to UFC. And well, there's no way that Jeffrey would be going through that tournament, because he's not from Asia, and also because he's better than that. I mean, this is the tournament that Anshul Jubilee won. Anshul Jubilee. And he won it by KO. Seriously, even though I'm biased, you've got to admit that Rin Nakamura and Reitzura are the only fighters who are even half decent to have come through this tournament. So yeah, Jeffrey Epstein isn't sinking to that level. And then finally, there's Dana White's Contender Series, which is the most common way that fighters get into the UFC nowadays. Dana White's Contender Series has produced multiple champions, like Jack Della Maddalena, an industry plant, and the guy who decided to stand and bang with Alex Pereira, Yuri Prohaska, and Khalil Rountree all in a row without even feinting a single takedown. However, it has produced champions, and that's why I think Jeffrey will go through this route. Now, the number one thing that you guys have to remember in Jeffrey's UFC journey is that he already has the most important key to success: connections. It's not about what you know, it's about who you know. And Jeffrey Epstein's connections would guarantee him a smooth way through Dana White's Contender Series, because Jeffrey's bestie is also Dana's bestie. Although from the Big Don's perspective, Dana probably isn't his bestie, but rather a runner-up behind Bibi. I'll also add that another person who was close to Jeffrey Epstein was Igor Zinoviev, who was Epstein's bodyguard and a former UFC fighter who some of you unks may remember as the guy who got brutally slept by Frank Shamrock at UFC 16. But regardless of what he might be known for, he was still a fighter with a background in Sambo, so we can be sure that Jeffrey Epstein would have at least one good training partner. Also, Igor Zinoviev, who was very close to Epstein, said that Epstein's passing by self-deletion was no accident. According to an interview he did, Igor said that, quote, "someone helped him do that." And when he was asked why this happened, he replied, "Listen, you know that's going a little too deep." So what I'm getting at here is that there's really no feasible way that a man in solitary confinement could... Hey Mossad, I'm trying to record a video here. Yes, it's a comedy video. Yes, it's a controlled opposition piece. Yeah, I'm trying to obfuscate things here, right? To make it easier to dismiss the allegations. Now, I thought you guys were chill with that. Okay, I'll try to be more careful, alright? Okay? Alright guys, I'm back. Anyways, getting to how Jeffrey Epstein's fight on Dana White's Contender Series would go, I think it's pretty clear that since Epstein is so well connected, he'd get an opponent he could style on easily. Epstein is 6 feet tall and walks around at around 185 pounds, so he's probably going to be fighting at either welterweight or lightweight. And since Epstein was walking around at 185 pounds in his later years, I think we can assume that prime Jeffrey Epstein could make 155 pounds. And speaking of opponents that Jeffrey Epstein could fight on Dana White's Contender Series to get a highlight reel finish, here are some options that the matchmakers could bring in. Angad Bisht, Sanjit Budwar, Mohsin Shaikh. Hell, once Anshul gets KO'd again and released from the UFC, they could let him have one more shot to get back into the UFC by having him fight Jeffrey. But I can tell you for certain that Jeffrey Epstein would KO any one of those guys out cold with his Carlos Prates Muay Thai. But anyways, after getting his ticket to the UFC, Jeffrey Epstein would be placed in the unranked section of the lightweight division. Now, the UFC lightweight division is filled with absolute killers from around the world. The Argentinian Estevan Rivapic, the Polish Mateusz Rebecki, the Scottish Chris Duncan, and the Pakistani Quillan Salkild. Even the unks like Michael Johnson and Carlos Diego Ferreira can be quite tricky opponents. But we all know that Jeffrey is going to have a few strings pulled for him, which is why he will face Tony Ferguson in his UFC debut. Now, of course, Tony has been released by the UFC after his record-breaking 8-fight loss streak. And now, Tony is out there taking brain damage from Salt Poppy, who is a guy that is most famous for knocking out Andy Worski, a former anti-SJW YouTuber who now runs a show called Kino Casino, where he speculates about whether Nick Fuentes and Destiny have had gay sex. Seriously, the decline of Tony Ferguson, it's just a bottomless pit at this point. But yeah, the UFC would absolutely bring Tony back to lose to Jeffrey Epstein. And when Dana White gets asked about whether it's ethical to let Tony fight, he'll answer like this. It's his own personal choice to fight. He's free to do as he pleases. If you want to fight after taking 8 losses in a row and countless blows to the head, it's your choice. If you want to abuse drugs and alcohol, that's your choice. If you want to gamble your life savings away, that's your choice. If you want to watch tons of porn, that's your choice. What? People need to be stopped from engaging in self-destructive behavior sometimes? Shut up, you hate freedom in America. But yeah, after Epstein makes El Cucuy's head hit the canvas harder than a laser-guided missile hitting a hospital on the West Bank, he'll be given more and more fighters who are obviously not UFC level or are past their prime. Some examples of potential matchups include Bobby King, coming off of 5 straight KO losses, 70-year-old Clay Guida, Trevor Peek, but in a special rules bout where standing hammer fists are banned, Bryce Mitchell being forced to fight up 2 weight classes for some mysterious reason, and Muhammad Yahya. Seriously, just Muhammad Yahya. He's that bad. But after getting a win streak against this competition, Jeffrey will be looking at the top 15. Now, from this point onwards, there are no easy fights. Except Benoit Saint-Denis. But let's be honest, Lucas Tracy's favorite Marauder is going to be brutally spinning wheel kicked out of the rankings by Brazilian McGregor. But then who would be a good opponent for Jeffrey to fight to get into the top 15? And sure, he might be able to win based on just his skills, but Dana White surely would want to guarantee that the Big Don's Golden Boy wins, which is why Dana would match him up with the one guy we know would be willing to take a dive in the lightweight rankings. Renato Money Moicano. What does Moicano love?
Moicano wants money!
And what does Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump have a lot of?
Money. I'm really rich. I'll show you that in a second.
So it's quite simple. Bribe Renato Moicano to lose to Jeffrey Epstein. Just like how IPAC bribes every single senator in the US. But once Jeffrey beats Renato Moicano, he'll be looking for a title eliminator against someone in the top 5. Now, you might be thinking, hey, how can a win over Renato Moicano earn you a title eliminator? And to answer that, well, it's absolutely not deserved whatsoever. But when has the UFC ever been subtle with pushing guys they want to have as champion? Regardless of whether it's Dana White and the UFC, or Donald Trump and the US government, or the bankers and financiers on Wall Street, many people in power aren't subtle with their favoritism and nepotism. Sean O'Malley got to fight number 1 ranked Petr Yan after beating only unranked opposition. Paddy Pimblett's past 3 opponents are on a combined 13-fight loss streak. Jared Kushner, who is Trump's son-in-law, was allowed to write up a peace plan for that one persistent conflict in the Levant despite having absolutely zero experience with Middle East diplomacy. Or even in Jeffrey's own case, there's how he somehow became a multi-billionaire investor after getting fired from his position as a high school math teacher for poor performance. You know, it almost makes you wonder if there was anybody connected to Jeffrey who also happened to be connected to foreign intelligence agencies. But anyways, nobody in the top 5 is an easy matchup, so regardless of who Jeffrey gets matched up against, he'll struggle. But there is one guy that I think Jeffrey Epstein could get a guaranteed win against, and that is Justin Gaethje. Now, the reason why Jeffrey could beat Gaethje is because of Gaethje's manager, Ali Abdelaziz. As many of you likely know, Ali Abdelaziz might have been involved with a certain event that happened in September around a quarter century ago. He's also an illegal immigrant without a passport. This has led to Ali being trapped in the United States and unable to travel abroad without notifying the authorities. And well, due to Jeffrey's close connections to the Big Don, he'd be able to give Ali what he's always wanted: a pardon. So I'm pretty sure that Ali would be able to convince Justin to hit the canvas like he's fighting Max Holloway again. Then, once Justin is out of the picture, I know what the UFC would do. They would ask Ilia Topuria to either retire or move up to welterweight, and then book Jeffrey Epstein versus Paddy Pimblett for the vacant lightweight title. Because, remember, if you're playing both sides, you can't lose. Regardless of whether Jeffrey Epstein or Paddy Pimblett walks away with the UFC belt, the real winners are always going to be Ari Emanuel, Mark Shapiro, and the owners of TKO stock. And once Jeffrey finishes his UFC run, he'll retire and become a coach like Pat Barry, grooming another generation of young, impressionable fighters.